Napoleon, Napoleon Bonaparte, May 1821, was a French military and political leader who rose to prominence during the French Revolution and led several successful campaigns during the Revolutionary Wars. As Napoleon I, he was Emperor of the French from 1804 until 1814, and again in 1815. Napoleon dominated European and global affairs for more than a decade, while leading France against a series of coalitions in the Napoleonic Wars. He won most of these wars and the vast majority of his battles, building a large empire that ruled over continental Europe before its final collapse in 1815. One of the greatest commanders in history, his wars and campaigns are studied at military schools worldwide. Napoleon's legacy has made him one of the most celebrated and controversial political figures in human history. He was born in Corsica to a relatively modest family from the minor nobility. When the revolution broke out in 1789, Napoleon was serving as an artillery officer in the French army. He quickly capitalized on the new political situation by returning to Corsica in hopes of starting a political career. After that venture failed, he came back to the military and rose rapidly through the ranks, ending up as commander of the Army of Italy after saving the governing directory by suppressing a revolt from royalist insurgents. At age 26, he began his first military campaign against the Austrians and their Italian allies, scoring a series of decisive victories, conquering the Italian peninsula in a year, and becoming a national hero. In 1798, he led a military expedition to Egypt that served as a springboard to political power. He engineered a coup in November 1799 and became first consul of the Republic. His rising ambition inspired him to go further, and in 1804 he became the first emperor of the French. Intractable differences with the British meant that the French were facing a third coalition by 1805. Napoleon shattered this coalition with decisive victories in the Ulm campaign and a historic triumph over Russia and Austria at the Battle of Austerlitz, which led to the elimination of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1806, the Fourth Coalition took up arms against him because Prussia became worried about growing French influence on the continent. Napoleon quickly knocked out Prussia at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, then marched the Grand Army deep into Eastern Europe and annihilated the Russians in June 1807 at the Battle of Friedland. France then forced the defeated nations of the Fourth Coalition to sign the treaties of Tilsit in July 1807, bringing an uneasy peace to the continent. Tilsit signified the high watermark of the French Empire. In 1809, the Austrians challenged the French again during the War of the Fifth Coalition, but Napoleon solidified his grip over Europe after triumphing at the Battle of Wagram in July. Hoping to extend the continental system meant to choke off British goods from the European mainland. Napoleon invaded Iberia and declared his brother Joseph, the King of Spain, in 1808. The Spanish and the Portuguese revolted with British support. The Peninsular War lasted 6 years, featured extensive guerrilla warfare, and ended in victory for the Allies. The continental system caused recurring diplomatic conflicts between France and its client states, especially Russia. Unwilling to bear the economic consequences of reduced trade, the Russians routinely violated the continental system and enticed Napoleon into another war. The French launched a major invasion of Russia in the summer of 1812. The resulting campaign witnessed the collapse of the Grand Army, the destruction of Russian lands and cities, and inspired a renewed push against Napoleon by his enemies. In 1813, Prussia and Austria joined Russian forces in a sixth coalition against France. A lengthy military campaign culminated in a large Allied army defeating Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813. The Allies then invaded France and captured Paris in the spring of 1814, forcing Napoleon to abdicate in April. He was exiled to the island of Elba near Rome, and the Bourbons were restored to power. However, Napoleon escaped from Elba in February 1815 and took control of France once again. The Allies responded by forming a seventh coalition, which defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in June. The British exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he spent the remainder of his years. His death in 1821, at the age of 51, was received with surprise, shock, and grief throughout Europe, leaving behind a memory that still persists. Napoleon had an extensive and powerful influence on the modern world, bringing liberal reforms to the numerous territories that he conquered and controlled, such as the Low Countries, Switzerland, and large parts of modern Italy and Germany. He implemented fundamental liberal policies in France and throughout Western Europe. His legal achievement, the Napoleonic Code, has influenced the legal systems of more than 70 nations around the world. British historian Andrew Roberts stated, "The ideas that underpin our modern world meritocracy, equality before the law, property rights, religious toleration, modern secular education, sound finances, and so on were championed, consolidated, codified, and geographically extended by Napoleon. To them, he added a rational and efficient local administration, an end to rural banditry, the encouragement of science and the arts, the abolition of feudalism, and the greatest codification of laws since the fall of the Roman Empire. Origins and education. Napoleon was born on 15 August 1769 to Carlo Maria di Buonaparte and Maria Letizia Remolino. In his family's ancestral home Casa, Buonaparte in Ajaccio, the capital of the island of Corsica. He was their fourth child and third son. This was a year after the island was transferred to France by the Republic of Genoa. He was christened Napoleon di Buonaparte, probably named after an uncle, an older brother who did not survive infancy, was the first of the sons to be called Napoleon. his 20s, he adopted the more French-sounding Napoleon Bonaparte. The Corsican Buonapartes were descended from minor Italian nobility of Tuscan origin, who had come to Corsica from Liguria in the 16th century. His father, noble Carlo Buonaparte, was an attorney and was named Corsica's representative to the court of Louis XVI in 1777. The dominant influence of Napoleon's childhood was his mother, Letizia Ramolino, whose firm discipline restrained a rambunctious child. Napoleon's maternal grandmother had married into the Swiss Fesch family in her second marriage, and Napoleon's uncle, the Cardinal Joseph Fesch, would fulfill the role as protector of the Bonaparte family for some years. He had an elder brother, Joseph, and younger siblings, Lucien, Elissa, Louis, Pauline, Caroline, and Jerome. A boy and girl were born before Joseph, but died in infancy. Napoleon was baptized as a Catholic. Napoleon's noble, moderately affluent background afforded him greater opportunities to study than were available to a typical Corsican of the time. In January 1779, he was enrolled at a religious school in Autun. In May, he was admitted to a military academy at Brienne-le-Château. His first language was Corsican, and he always spoke French with a marked Corsican accent and never learned to spell French properly. He was teased by other students for his accent and applied himself to reading. An examiner observed that Napoleon has always been distinguished for his application in mathematics. He is fairly well acquainted with history and geography. This boy would make an excellent sailor. On completion of his studies at Brienne in 1784, Napoleon was admitted to the elite École Militaire in Paris. He trained to become an artillery officer, and when his father's death reduced his income, was forced to complete the 2-year course in 1 year. He was the first Corsican to graduate from the École Militaire. He was examined by the famed scientist Pierre-Simon Laplace. Early career. Upon graduating in September 1785, Bonaparte was commissioned a second lieutenant in La Fère Artillery Regiment. He served in Valence and Auxonne until after the outbreak of the Revolution in 1789, and took nearly 2 years' leave in Corsica and Paris during this period. At this time, he was a fervent Corsican nationalist and wrote to Corsican leader Pasqual Paoli in May 1789, "As the nation was perishing, I was born. 30,000 Frenchmen were vomited on to our shores, drowning the throne of liberty in waves of blood." Such was the odious sight which was the first to strike me. He spent the early years of the Revolution in Corsica, fighting in a complex 3-way struggle among royalists, revolutionaries, and Corsican nationalists. He was a supporter of the Republican Jacobin movement, organizing clubs in Corsica, and was given command over a battalion of volunteers. He was promoted to captain in the regular army in July 1792, despite exceeding his leave of absence and leading a riot against a French army in Corsica. He returned to Corsica and came into conflict with Paoli, who had decided to split with France and sabotage the French assault on the Sardinian island of La Madonna. Bonaparte and his family fled to the French mainland in June 1793 because of the split with Paoli. Siege of Toulon. In July 1793, Bonaparte published a pro-republican pamphlet entitled Le Souper de Beaucaire, Supper at Beaucaire, which gained him the support of Augustin Robespierre, younger brother of the revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre. With the help of his fellow Corsican Antin Christophe Salesti, Bonaparte was appointed artillery commander of the Republican forces at the siege of Toulon. He adopted a plan to capture a hill where Republican guns could dominate the city's harbor and force the British to evacuate. The assault on the position led to the capture of the city, but during it, Bonaparte was wounded in the thigh. He was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. Catching the attention of the Committee of Public Safety, he was put in charge of the artillery of France's army of Italy. Napoleon spent time as inspector of coastal fortifications on the Mediterranean coast near Marseille, while he was waiting for confirmation of the army of Italy post. He devised plans for attacking the Kingdom of Sardinia as part of France's campaign against the First Coalition. Augustin, Robespierre, and Salesti were ready to listen to the freshly promoted artillery general. The French army carried out Bonaparte's plan in the Battle of Siorgio in April 1794, and then advanced to seize Ormia in the mountains. From Ormia, they headed west to outflank the Austro-Sardinian positions around Seorge. After this campaign, Augustin Robespierre sent Bonaparte on a mission to the Republic of Genoa to determine that country's intentions towards France. 13 Vendémiaire. Some contemporaries alleged that Bonaparte was put under house arrest at Nice for his association with the Robespierres following their fall in the Thermidorian reaction in July 1794. But Napoleon's secretary Bourrienne disputed the allegation in his memoirs. According to Bourrienne, jealousy was responsible between the army of the Alps and the army of Italy, with whom Napoleon was seconded at the time. Bonaparte dispatched an impassioned defense in a letter to the Commissar Salesti, and he was subsequently acquitted of any wrongdoing. He was released within 2 weeks, and due to his technical skills, was asked to draw up plans to attack Italian positions in the context of France's war with Austria. He also took part in an expedition to take back Corsica from the British, but the French were repulsed by the British Royal Navy. By 1795, Bonaparte had become engaged to Desirée Clary, daughter of François Clary. Desirée's sister, Julie Clary, had married Bonaparte's elder brother Joseph. In April 1795, he was assigned to the Army of the West, which was engaged in the war in the Vendée, a civil war, and royalist counter-revolution in Vendée, a region in west-central France on the Atlantic Ocean. As an infantry command, it was a demotion from artillery general for which the army already had a full quota, and he pleaded poor health to avoid the posting. He was moved to the Bureau of Topography of the Committee of Public Safety and sought unsuccessfully to be transferred to Constantinople in order to offer his services to the Sultan. During this period, he wrote the romantic novella Clisson et Eugenie about a soldier and his lover, in a clear parallel to Bonaparte's own relationship with Desirée. On 15 September, Bonaparte was removed from the list of generals in regular service for his refusal to serve in the Vendée campaign. He faced a difficult financial situation and reduced career prospects. On 3 October, royalists in Paris declared a rebellion against the National Convention. Paul Barras, a leader of the Thermidorian reaction, knew of Bonaparte's military exploits at Toulon and gave him command of the improvised forces in defense of the convention in the Tuileries Palace. Napoleon had seen the massacre of the king's Swiss Guard there 3 years earlier and realized that artillery would be the key to its defense. He ordered a young cavalry officer named Joachim Murat to seize large cannons and use them to repel the attackers on 5 October 1795, 13 Vendémiaire, an IV in the French Republican calendar. 1,400 royalists died, and the rest fled. He had cleared the streets with a whiff of grape shot. According to 19th century historian Thomas Carlyle in the French Revolution, a history, the defeat of the royalist insurrection extinguished the threat to the convention and earned Bonaparte sudden fame, wealth, and the patronage of the new government, the Directory. Murat married one of Napoleon's sisters and became his brother-in-law. He also served under Napoleon as one of his generals. Bonaparte was promoted to commander of the interior and given command of the army of Italy. Within weeks, he was romantically attached to Joséphine de Beauharnais, the former mistress of Barras. The couple married on 9 March 1796 in a civil ceremony. First Italian campaign. 2 days after the marriage, Bonaparte left Paris to take command of the army of Italy. He immediately went on the offensive, hoping to defeat the forces of Piedmont before their Austrian allies could intervene. In a series of rapid victories during the Montagnat campaign, he knocked Piedmont out of the war in 2 weeks. The French then focused on the Austrians for the remainder of the war, the highlight of which became the protracted struggle for Mantua. The Austrians launched a series of offensives against the French to break the siege, but Napoleon defeated every relief effort, scoring victories at the battles of Castiglione, Bassano, Arcole, and Rivoli. The decisive French triumph at Rivoli in January 1797 led to the collapse of the Austrian position in Italy. At Rivoli, the Austrians lost up to 14,000 men, while the French lost about 5,000. The next phase of the campaign featured the French invasion of the Habsburg heartlands. French forces in southern Germany had been defeated by the Archduke Charles in 1796, but the Archduke withdrew his forces to protect Vienna after learning about Napoleon's assault. In the first encounter between the two commanders, Napoleon pushed back his opponent and advanced deep into Austrian territory after winning at the Battle of Tarvis in March 1797. The Austrians were alarmed by the French thrust that reached all the way to Leoben, about 100 km from Vienna, and finally decided to sue for peace. The Treaty of Leoben, followed by the more comprehensive Treaty of Campo Formio, gave France control of most of northern Italy and the Low Countries, and a secret clause promised the Republic of Venice to Austria. Bonaparte marched on Venice and forced its surrender, ending 1,100 years of independence. He also authorized the French to loot treasures, such as the horses of Saint Mark. His application of conventional military ideas to real-world situations enabled his military triumphs, such as creative use of artillery as a mobile force to support his infantry. He stated later in life, "I have fought 60 battles, and I have learned nothing which I did not know at the beginning." Look at Caesar. He fought the first like the last. Bonaparte could win battles by concealment of troop deployments and concentration of his forces on the hinge of an enemy's weakened front. If he could not use his favorite envelopment strategy, he would take up the central position and attack two cooperating forces at their hinge, swing round to fight one until it fled, then turn to face the other. In this Italian campaign, Bonaparte's army captured 150,000 prisoners, 540 cannons, and 170 standards. The French army fought 67 actions and won 18 pitched battles through superior artillery technology and Bonaparte's tactics. During the campaign, Bonaparte became increasingly influential in French politics. He founded 2 newspapers, one for the troops in his army and another for circulation in France. The Royalists attacked Bonaparte for looting Italy and warned that he might become a dictator. All told, Napoleon's forces extracted an estimated $45 million in funds from Italy during their campaign there, another $12 million in precious metals and jewels. Atop that, his forces confiscated more than 300 priceless paintings and sculptures. Bonaparte sent General Pierre Augereau to Paris to lead a coup d'etat and purge the Royalists on 4 September, coup of 18 Fructidor. This left Barras and his Republican allies in control again, but dependent on Bonaparte, who proceeded to peace negotiations with Austria. These negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Campo Formio, and Bonaparte returned to Paris in December. As a hero, he met Talleyrand, France's new foreign minister, who served in the same capacity for Emperor Napoleon, and they began to prepare for an invasion of Britain. Egyptian expedition. After 2 months of planning, Bonaparte decided that France's naval power was not yet strong enough to confront the British Royal Navy. He decided on a military expedition to seize Egypt and thereby undermine Britain's access to its trade interests in India. Bonaparte wished to establish a French presence in the Middle East, with the ultimate dream of linking with Tipu Sultan, a Muslim enemy of the British in India. Napoleon assured the Directory that as soon as he had conquered Egypt, he will establish relations with the Indian princes and, together with them, attack the English in their possessions. The Directory agreed in order to secure a trade route to India. In May 1798, Bonaparte was elected a member of the French Academy of Sciences. His Egyptian expedition included a group of 167 scientists, with mathematicians, naturalists, chemists, and geodesists among them. Their discoveries included the Rosetta Stone, and their work was published in the Description de l'Egypte in 1809. En route to Egypt, Bonaparte reached Malta on 9 June 1798, then controlled by the Knights Hospitaller. Grand Master Ferdinand von Hompesch zu Balheim surrendered after token resistance, and Bonaparte captured an important naval base with the loss of only 3 men. General Bonaparte and his expedition eluded pursuit by the Royal Navy and landed at Alexandria on 1 July. He fought the Battle of Shubrikit against the Mamluks, Egypt's ruling military caste. This helped the French practice their defensive tactic for the Battle of the Pyramids, fought on 21 July, about 24 km, 15 mi from the pyramids. General Bonaparte's forces of 25,000 roughly equaled those of the Mamluks, Egyptian cavalry, 29 French, and approximately 2,000 Egyptians were killed. The victory boosted the morale of the French army. On 1 August, the British fleet under Horatio Nelson captured or destroyed all but 2 French vessels in the Battle of the Nile, defeating Bonaparte's goal to strengthen the French position in the Mediterranean. His army had succeeded in a temporary increase of French power in Egypt, though it faced repeated uprisings. In early 1799, he moved an army into the Ottoman province of Damascus, Syria, and Galilee. Bonaparte led these 13,000 French soldiers in the conquest of the coastal towns of Arish, Gaza, Jaffa, and Haifa. The attack on Jaffa was particularly brutal. Bonaparte discovered that many of the defenders were former prisoners of war, ostensibly on parole. So he ordered the garrison and 1,400 prisoners to be executed by bayonet or drowning to save bullets. Men, women, and children were robbed and murdered for 3 days. Bonaparte began with an army of 13,000 men. 500 were reported missing, 1,200 died in combat, and thousands perished from disease, mostly bubonic plague. He failed to reduce the fortress of Acre, so he marched his army back to Egypt in May. To speed up the retreat, Bonaparte ordered plague-stricken men to be poisoned with opium. The number who died remains disputed, ranging from a low of 30 to a high of 580. He also brought out 1,000 wounded men. Back in Egypt on 25 July, Bonaparte defeated an Ottoman amphibious invasion at Abukir. Ruler of France while in Egypt, Bonaparte stayed informed of European affairs. He learned that France had suffered a series of defeats in the War of the Second Coalition. On 24 August 1799, he took advantage of the temporary departure of British ships from French coastal ports and set sail for France, despite the fact that he had received no explicit orders from Paris. The army was left in the charge of Jean-Baptiste Kleber. Unknown to Bonaparte, the Directory had sent him orders to return to ward off possible invasions of French soil, but poor lines of communication prevented the delivery of these messages. By the time that he reached Paris in October, France's situation had been improved by a series of victories. The Republic, however, was bankrupt, and the ineffective Directory was unpopular with the French population. The Directory discussed Bonaparte's desertion, but was too weak to punish him. Despite the failures in Egypt, Napoleon returned to a hero's welcome. He drew together an alliance with Director Emmanuel Joseph Sigues, his brother Lucien, Speaker of the Council of 500 Roger Ducos, Director Joseph Fauchet, and Talleyrand, and they overthrew the Directory by a coup d'etat on 9 November 1799. The 18th Brumaire, according to the revolutionary calendar, closing down the Council of 500. Napoleon became first consul for 10 years, with 2 consuls appointed by him who had consultative voices only. His power was confirmed by the new Constitution of the year VII, originally devised by Sigues to give Napoleon a minor role, but rewritten by Napoleon and accepted by direct popular vote, 3 million in favor, 1,567 opposed. The Constitution preserved the appearance of a republic, but in reality established a dictatorship. French consulate. Napoleon established a political system that historian Martin Léon called dictatorship by plebiscite. Worried by the democratic forces unleashed by the revolution, but unwilling to ignore them entirely, Napoleon resorted to regular electoral consultations with the French people on his road to imperial power. He drafted the Constitution of the year VII and secured his own election as first consul, taking up residence at the Tuileries. The Constitution was approved in a rigged plebiscite held the following January, with 99.94% officially listed as voting yes. Napoleon's brother, Lucien, had falsified the returns to show that 3 million people had participated in the plebiscite. The real number was 1.5 million. Political observers at the time assumed the eligible French voting public numbered about 5 million people. So the regime artificially doubled the participation rate to indicate popular enthusiasm for the consulate. In the first few months of the consulate, with war in Europe still raging and internal instability still plaguing the country, Napoleon's grip on power remained very tenuous. In the spring of 1800, Napoleon and his troops crossed the Swiss Alps into Italy, aiming to surprise the Austrian armies that had reoccupied the peninsula when Napoleon was still in Egypt. After a difficult crossing over the Alps, the French army entered the plains of northern Italy virtually unopposed. While one French army approached from the north, the Austrians were busy with another stationed in Genoa, which was besieged by a substantial force. The fierce resistance of this French army, under André Massena, gave the northern force some time to carry out their operations with little interference. After spending several days looking for each other, the two armies collided at the Battle of Marengo on 14 June. General Melas had a numerical advantage, fielding about 30,000 Austrian soldiers, while Napoleon commanded 24,000 French troops. The battle began favorably for the Austrians, as their initial attack surprised the French and gradually drove them back. Melas stated that he'd won the battle and retired to his headquarters around 3 p.m., leaving his subordinates in charge of pursuing the French. The French lines never broke during their tactical retreat. Napoleon constantly rode out among the troops, urging them to stand and fight. Late in the afternoon, a full division under Desaix arrived on the field and reversed the tide of the battle. A series of artillery barrages and cavalry charges decimated the Austrian army, which fled over the Bormida River back to Alessandria, leaving behind 14,000 casualties. The following day, the Austrian army agreed to abandon northern Italy once more with the Convention of Alessandria, which granted them safe passage to friendly soil in exchange for their fortresses throughout the region. Although critics have blamed Napoleon for several tactical mistakes preceding the battle, they have also praised his audacity for selecting a risky campaign strategy, choosing to invade the Italian peninsula from the north when the vast majority of French invasions came from the west, near or along the coastline. As Chandler points out, Napoleon spent almost a year getting the Austrians out of Italy in his first campaign. In 1800, it took him only a month to achieve the same goal. German strategist and Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen concluded that Bonaparte did not annihilate his enemy, but eliminated him and rendered him harmless, while the object of the campaign, the conquest of North Italy, Napoleon's triumph at Marengo, secured his political authority and boosted his popularity back home, but it did not lead to an immediate peace. Bonaparte's brother, Joseph, led the complex negotiations in Lunéville and reported that Austria, emboldened by British support, would not acknowledge the new territory that France had acquired. As negotiations became increasingly fractious, Bonaparte gave orders to his general Mauro to strike Austria once more. Mauro and the French swept through Bavaria and scored an overwhelming victory at Hohenlinden in December 1800. As a result, the Austrians capitulated and signed the Treaty of Lunéville in February 1801. The treaty reaffirmed and expanded earlier French gains at Campo Formio. Britain now remained the only nation that was still at war with France. Temporary peace in Europe. After a decade of constant warfare, France and Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens in March 1802, bringing the Revolutionary Wars to an end. Amiens called for the withdrawal of British troops from recently conquered colonial territories, as well as for assurances to curtail the expansionary goals of the French Republic. With Europe at peace and the economy recovering, Napoleon's popularity soared to its highest levels under the consulate, both domestically and abroad. In a new plebiscite during the spring of 1802, the French public came out in huge numbers to approve a constitution that made the consulate permanent, essentially elevating Napoleon to dictator for life. Whereas the plebiscite 2 years earlier had brought out 1.5 million people to the polls, the new referendum enticed 3.6 million to go and vote. There was no secret ballot in 1802, and few people wanted to openly defy the regime. The Constitution gained approval with over 99% of the vote. His broad powers were spelled out in the new Constitution. Article 1. The French people name, and the Senate proclaims Napoleon Bonaparte first consul for life. After 1802, he was generally referred to as Napoleon rather than Bonaparte. The brief peace in Europe allowed Napoleon to focus on the French colonies abroad. Saint-Domingue had managed to acquire a high level of political autonomy during the Revolutionary Wars, with Toussaint Louverture installing himself as de facto dictator by 1801. Napoleon saw his chance to recuperate the formerly wealthy colony when he signed the Treaty of Amiens. During the Revolution, the National Convention voted to abolish slavery in February 1794. Under the terms of Amiens, however, Napoleon agreed to appease British demands by not abolishing slavery in any colonies where the 1794 decree had never been implemented. The resulting Law of 20 may never apply to colonies like Guadeloupe or Guyane, even though rogue generals and other officials used the pretext of peace as an opportunity to reinstate slavery in some of these places. The Law of 20 may officially restore the slave trade to the Caribbean colonies. Not slavery itself. Napoleon sent an expedition under General Leclerc designed to reassert control over Saint-Domingue. Although the French managed to capture Toussaint Louverture, the expedition failed when high rates of disease crippled the French army. In May 1803, the last 8,000 French troops left the island, and the slaves proclaimed an independent republic that they called Haiti in 1804. Seeing the failure of his colonial efforts, Napoleon decided in 1803 to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States, instantly doubling the size of the U.S. The selling price in the Louisiana Purchase was less than 3 cents per acre, a total of $15 million. The peace with Britain proved to be uneasy and controversial. Britain did not evacuate Malta as promised and protested against Bonaparte's annexation of Piedmont and his act of mediation, which established a new Swiss confederation. Neither of these territories were covered by Amiens, but they inflamed tensions significantly. The dispute culminated in a declaration of war by Britain in May 1803. Napoleon responded by reassembling the invasion camp at Boulogne. During the consulate, Napoleon faced several royalist and Jacobin assassination plots, including the Conspiration des Poignards, dagger plot, in October 1800, and the plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise, also known as the Infernal Machine. 2 months later, in January 1804, his police uncovered an assassination plot against him that involved Marot and which was ostensibly sponsored by the Bourbon family, the former rulers of France. On the advice of Talleyrand, Napoleon ordered the kidnapping of the Duke of Enghien, violating the sovereignty of Baden. The Duke was quickly executed after a secret military trial, even though he had not been involved in the plot. Enghien's execution infuriated royal courts throughout Europe, becoming one of the contributing political factors for the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars. To expand his power, Napoleon used these assassination plots to justify the creation of an imperial system based on the Roman model. He believed that a Bourbon restoration would be more difficult if his family's succession was entrenched in the Constitution. Launching yet another referendum, Napoleon was elected as Emperor of the French by a tally exceeding 99%. As with the life consulate 2 years earlier, this referendum produced heavy participation, bringing out almost 3.6 million voters to the polls. Napoleon's coronation took place on 2 December 1804. 2 separate crowns were brought for the ceremony: a golden laurel wreath recalling the Roman Empire, and a replica of Charlemagne's crown. Napoleon entered the ceremony wearing the laurel wreath and kept it on his head throughout the proceedings. For the official coronation, he raised the Charlemagne crown over his own head in a symbolic gesture, but never placed it on top because he was already wearing the golden wreath. Instead, he placed the crown on Josephine's head, the event commemorated in the officially sanctioned painting by Jacques-Louis David. Napoleon was also crowned King of Italy with the Iron Crown of Lombardy at the Cathedral of Milan on 26 May 1805. He created 18 marshals of the empire from amongst his top generals to secure the allegiance of the army. Marriages and children. Napoleon married Josephine de Beauharnais in 1796 when he was 26. She was a 32-year-old widow whose first husband had been executed during the Revolution. Until she met Bonaparte, she had been known as Rose, a name which he disliked. He called her Josephine instead, and she went by this name henceforth. Bonaparte often sent her love letters while on his campaigns. He formally adopted her son Eugene and cousin Stephanie and arranged dynastic marriages for them. Josephine had her daughter Hortense marry Napoleon's brother Louis. Josephine had lovers, such as Lieutenant Hippolyte Charles, during Napoleon's Italian campaign. Napoleon learnt of that affair, and a letter he wrote about it was intercepted by the British and published widely to embarrass Napoleon. Napoleon had his own affairs too. During the Egyptian campaign, he took Pauline Belle-Fors, the wife of a junior officer, as his mistress. She became known as Cleopatra. While Napoleon's mistresses had children by him, Josephine did not produce an heir, possibly because of either the stresses of her imprisonment during the Reign of Terror or an abortion she may have had in her 20s. Napoleon chose divorce so he could remarry in search of an heir. Despite his divorce from Josephine, Napoleon showed his dedication to her for the rest of his life. When he heard the news of her death while on exile in Elba, he locked himself in his room and would not come out for 2 full days. Her name would also be his final word on his deathbed in 1821. In March 1810, he married the 19-year-old Marie-Louise, Archduchess of Austria, and a great niece of Marie Antoinette by proxy. Thus, he had married into a German royal and imperial family. Louise was less than happy with the arrangement, at least at first, stating, just to see the man would be the worst form of torture. Her great-aunt had been executed in France, while Napoleon had fought numerous campaigns against Austria all throughout his military career. However, she seemed to warm up to him over time. After her wedding, she wrote to her father, "He loves me very much. I respond to his love sincerely. There is something very fetching and very eager about him that is impossible to resist." Napoleon and Marie-Louise remained married until his death, though she did not join him in exile on Elba, and thereafter never saw her husband again. The couple had one child, Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles, 1811-1832, known from birth as the King of Rome. He became Napoleon II in 1814 and reigned for only 2 weeks. He was awarded the title of the Duke of Reichstadt in 1818 and died of tuberculosis, aged 21. With no children, Napoleon acknowledged one illegitimate son, Charles Léon, 1806-1881, by Eleanor de Noule de la Plaine, Alexander Kolonowski, 1810-1868, the son of his mistress Maria Waleska, although acknowledged by Waleska's husband, was also widely known to be his child, and the DNA of his direct male descendant has been used to help confirm Napoleon's Y chromosome haplotype. He may have had further unacknowledged illegitimate offspring as well, such as Eugen Medrel von Muhlfeld by Emily Victoria Krauss and Hailing Napoleon Bonaparte, 1816-1907, by Albin de Montholin, Memory and Evaluation, Criticism. In the political realm, historians debate whether Napoleon was an enlightened despot who laid the foundations of modern Europe, or instead, a megalomaniac who wrought greater misery than any man before the coming of Hitler. Many historians have concluded that he had grandiose foreign policy ambitions. The continental powers as late as 1808 were willing to give him nearly all of his gains and titles, but some scholars maintain he was overly aggressive and pushed for too much until his empire collapsed. Napoleon ended lawlessness and disorder in post-revolutionary France. He was considered a tyrant and usurper by his opponents, charge that he was not troubled when faced with the prospect of war and death for thousands, turned his search for undisputed rule into a series of conflicts throughout Europe, and ignored treaties and conventions alike. His role in the Haitian Revolution and decision to reinstate slavery in France's overseas colonies are controversial and affect his reputation. Napoleon institutionalized plunder of conquered territories. French museums contain art stolen by Napoleon's forces from across Europe. Artifacts were brought to the Musée du Louvre for a grand central museum. His example would later serve as inspiration for more notorious imitators. He was compared to Adolf Hitler, most famously by the historian Pieter Jael in 1947, and Claude Rib in 2005. David G. Chandler, a foremost historian of Napoleonic warfare, wrote in 1973 that nothing could be more degrading to the former Napoleon and more flattering to the latter. The comparison is odious. On the whole, Napoleon was inspired by a noble dream, wholly dissimilar from Hitler's. Napoleon left great and lasting testimonies to his genius in codes of law and national identities which survive to the present day. Adolf Hitler left nothing but destruction. Critics argue Napoleon's true legacy must reflect the loss of status for France and needless deaths brought by his rule. Historian Victor Davis Hanson writes, "After all, the military record is unquestioned. 17 years of wars, perhaps 6 million Europeans dead, France bankrupt, her overseas colonies lost." Macklin states that he can be viewed as the man who set back European economic life for a generation by the dislocating impact of his wars. Vincent Cronin replies that such criticism relies on the flawed premise that Napoleon was responsible for the wars which bear his name, when in fact France was the victim of a series of coalitions which aimed to destroy the ideals of the revolution. Propaganda and memory. Napoleon's use of propaganda contributed to his rise to power, legitimated his regime, and established his image for posterity. Strict censorship, controlling aspects of the press, books, theater, and art, was part of his propaganda scheme, aimed at portraying him as bringing desperately wanted peace and stability to France. The propagandistic rhetoric changed in relation to events and to the atmosphere of Napoleon's reign, focusing first on his role as a general in the army and identification as a soldier, and moving to his role as emperor and a civil leader. Specifically targeting his civilian audience, Napoleon fostered a relationship with the contemporary art community, taking an active role in commissioning and controlling different forms of art production to suit his propaganda goals. Hasreising 2004 explores how Napoleon's image and memory are best understood. They played a key role in collective political defiance of the Bourbon Restoration monarchy in 1815-1830. People from different walks of life and areas of France, particularly Napoleonic veterans, drew on the Napoleonic legacy and its connections with the ideals of the 1789 revolution. Widespread rumors of Napoleon's return from St. Helena and Napoleon as an inspiration for patriotism, individual and collective liberties, and political mobilization manifested themselves in seditious materials, displaying the tricolor and rosettes. There were also subversive activities celebrating anniversaries of Napoleon's life and reign, and disrupting royal celebrations. They demonstrated the prevailing and successful goal of the varied supporters of Napoleon to constantly destabilize the Bourbon regime. Data 2005 shows that, following the collapse of militaristic Boulongism in the late 1880s, the Napoleonic legend was divorced from party politics and revived in popular culture, concentrating on 2 plays and 2 novels from the period: Victorien Sardou's Madame Sansgarn, 1893, Maurice Barrès's Les Déracinés, 1897, Edmond Rostand's L'Aiglon, 1900, and André de Lorde and Gyp's Napoleonette, 1913. Data examines how writers and critics of the Belle Epoque exploited the Napoleonic legend for diverse political and cultural ends. Reduced to a minor character, the new fictional Napoleon became not a world historical figure, but an intimate one, fashioned by individuals' needs and consumed as popular entertainment. In their attempts to represent the emperor as a figure of national unity, proponents and detractors of the Third Republic used the legend as a vehicle for exploring anxieties about gender and fears about the processes of democratization that accompanied this new era of mass politics and culture. International Napoleonic congresses take place regularly, with participation by members of the French and American military, French politicians, and scholars from different countries. In January 2012, the mayor of Montereau-Faultion, near Paris, the site of a late victory of Napoleon, proposed development of Napoleon's Bivouac, a commemorative theme park at a projected cost of €200 million. Long-term influence outside France. Napoleon was responsible for spreading the values of the French Revolution to other countries, especially in legal reform and the abolition of serfdom. After the fall of Napoleon, not only was Napoleonic code retained by conquered countries, including the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of Italy and Germany, but has been used as the basis of certain parts of law outside Europe, including the Dominican Republic, the U.S. state of Louisiana, and the Canadian province of Quebec. The memory of Napoleon in Poland is favorable for his support for independence and opposition to Russia, his legal code, the abolition of serfdom, and the introduction of modern middle-class bureaucracies. Napoleon could be considered one of the founders of modern Germany. After dissolving the Holy Roman Empire, he reduced the number of German states from 300 to less than 50 prior to the German unification. A byproduct of the French occupation was a strong development in German nationalism. Napoleon also significantly aided the United States when he agreed to sell the territory of Louisiana for $15 million during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. That territory almost doubled the size of the United States, adding the equivalent of 13 states to the Union. Exile on St. Helena. Britain kept Napoleon on the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, 1,870 km, 1,162 mi, from the west coast of Africa. Napoleon was moved to Longwood House there in December 1815. It had fallen into disrepair, and the location was damp, windswept, and unhealthy. The Times published articles insinuating the British government was trying to hasten his death, and he often complained of the living conditions in letters to the governor and his custodian, Hudson Lowe. With a small cadre of followers, Napoleon dictated his memoirs and grumbled about conditions. Lowe cut Napoleon's expenditure, ruled that no gifts were allowed if they mentioned his imperial status, and made his supporters sign a guarantee they would stay with the prisoner indefinitely. There were rumors of plots and even of his escape, but in reality, no serious attempts were made. For English poet Lord Byron, Napoleon was the epitome of the romantic hero, the persecuted, lonely, and flawed genius. Death, his personal physician, Barry O'Meara, warned London that his declining state of health was mainly caused by the harsh treatment. Napoleon confined himself for months on end in his damp and wretched habitation of Longwood. In February 1821, Napoleon's health began to deteriorate rapidly. He reconciled with the Catholic Church. He died on 5 May 1821, after confession, extreme unction, and viaticum, in the presence of Father Ange Vignali. His last words were, France, l'armée, terre d'armée, Joséphine. France, army, head of the army, Joséphine. Napoleon's original death mask was created around 6 May, although it is not clear which doctor created it. In his will, he had asked to be buried on the banks of the Seine, but the British governor said he should be buried on St. Helena in the Valley of the Willows. In 1840, Louis Philippe I obtained permission from the British to return Napoleon's remains to France. On 15 December 1840, a state funeral was held. The hearse proceeded from the Arc de Triomphe down the Champs-Élysées, across the Place de la Concorde to the Esplanade des Invalides, and then to the cupola in St. Jerome's Chapel, where it remained until the tomb designed by Louis Visconti was completed. In 1861, Napoleon's remains were entombed in a porphyry sarcophagus in the crypt under the dome at Les Invalides. Cause of death. The cause of his death has been debated. Napoleon's physician, Francois Carlo Antimarchi, led the autopsy, which found the cause of death to be stomach cancer. Antimarchi did not sign the official report Napoleon's father had died of stomach cancer, although this was seemingly unknown at the time of the autopsy. Antimarchi found evidence of a stomach ulcer. This was the most convenient explanation for the British, who wanted to avoid criticism over their care of Napoleon. In 1955, the diaries of Napoleon's valet, Louis Marchand, were published. His description of Napoleon in the months before his death led Sten Verschaffud in a 1961 paper in Nature to put forward other causes for his death, including deliberate arsenic poisoning. Arsenic was used as a poison during the era because it was undetectable when administered over a long period. Verschaffud, in a 1978 book with Ben Wider, noted that Napoleon's body was found to be well preserved when moved in 1840. Arsenic is a strong preservative, and therefore this supported the poisoning hypothesis. Verschaffud and Wider observed that Napoleon had attempted to quench abnormal thirst by drinking large amounts of orgeat syrup that contained cyanide compounds in the almonds used for flavoring. They maintained that the potassium tartrate used in his treatment prevented his stomach from expelling these compounds, and that his thirst was a symptom of the poison. Their hypothesis was that the calomel given to Napoleon became an overdose, which killed him and left extensive tissue damage behind. According to a 2007 article, the type of arsenic found in Napoleon's hair shafts was mineral, the most toxic, and according to toxicologist Patrick Kintz, this supported the conclusion that he was murdered. There have been modern studies that have supported the original autopsy finding. In a 2008 study, researchers analyzed samples of Napoleon's hair from throughout his life, as well as samples from his family and other contemporaries. All samples had high levels of arsenic, approximately 100 times higher than the current average. According to these researchers, Napoleon's body was already heavily contaminated with arsenic as a boy, and the high arsenic concentration in his hair was not caused by intentional poisoning. People were constantly exposed to arsenic from glues and dyes throughout their lives. Studies published in 2007 and 2008 dismissed evidence of arsenic poisoning and confirmed evidence of peptic ulcer and gastric cancer as the cause of death. Religion. Napoleon's baptism took place in Ajaccio on 21 July 1771. He was piously raised as a Catholic, but he never developed much faith. As an adult, Napoleon was a deist. Napoleon's deity was an absent and distant god. However, he had a keen appreciation of the power of organized religion in social and political affairs, and paid a great deal of attention to bending it to his purposes. He noted the influence of Catholicism's rituals and splendors. Napoleon had a civil marriage with Josephine de Beauharnais without religious ceremony. Napoleon was crowned emperor on 2 December 1804 at Notre Dame de Paris in a ceremony presided over by Pope Pius VII. On 1 April 1810, Napoleon married the Austrian Princess Marie-Louise in a Catholic ceremony. During his brother's rule in Spain, he abolished the Spanish Inquisition in 1813. Concordat. Further information. Concordat of 1801, seeking national reconciliation between revolutionaries and Catholics. The Concordat of 1801 was signed on 15 July 1801 between Napoleon and Pope Pius VII. It solidified the Roman Catholic Church as the majority church of France and brought back most of its civil status. The hostility of devout Catholics against the state had now largely been resolved. It did not restore the vast church lands and endowments that had been seized during the Revolution and sold off. As a part of the Concordat, he presented another set of laws called the Organic Articles. While the Concordat restored much power to the papacy, the balance of church-state relations had tilted firmly in Napoleon's favor. He selected the bishops and supervised church finances. Napoleon and the Pope both found the Concordat useful. Similar arrangements were made with the church in territories controlled by Napoleon, especially Italy and Germany. Now, Napoleon could win favor with the Catholics while also controlling Rome in a political sense. Napoleon said in April 1801, "Skillful conquerors have not got entangled with priests. They can both contain them and use them." French children were issued a catechism that taught them to love and respect Napoleon. Religious emancipation. Napoleon emancipated Jews, as well as Protestants in Catholic countries and Catholics in Protestant countries, from laws which restricted them to ghettos. And he expanded their rights to property, worship, and careers. Despite the anti-Semitic reaction to Napoleon's policies from foreign governments and within France, he believed emancipation would benefit France by attracting Jews to the country, given the restrictions they faced elsewhere. He stated, "I will never accept any proposals that will obligate the Jewish people to leave France, because to me, the Jews are the same as any other citizen in our country. It takes weakness to chase them out of the country, but it takes strength to assimilate them." He was seen as so favorable to the Jews that the Russian Orthodox Church formally condemned him as Antichrist and the enemy of God. Personality. Historians emphasize the strength of the ambition that took Napoleon from an obscure village to command of most of Europe. George F. E. Roudet stresses his rare combination of will, intellect, and physical vigor. At 5 ft6 in 168 cm, he was not physically imposing, but in one-on-one situations, he typically had a hypnotic effect on people and seemingly bent the strongest leaders to his will. He understood military technology, but was not an innovator in that regard. He was an innovator in using the financial, bureaucratic, and diplomatic resources of France. He could rapidly dictate a series of complex commands to his subordinates, keeping in mind where major units were expected to be at each future point, and like a chess master, seeing the best plays moves ahead. Napoleon maintained strict, efficient work habits, prioritizing what needed to be done. He cheated at cards, but repaid the losses. He had to win at everything he attempted. He kept relays of staff and secretaries at work. Unlike many generals, Napoleon did not examine history to ask what Hannibal or Alexander or anyone else did in a similar situation. Critics said he won many battles simply because of luck. Napoleon responded, "Give me lucky generals," aware that luck comes to leaders who recognize opportunity and seize it. Dwyer states that Napoleon's victories at Austerlitz and Jena in 1805-06 heightened his sense of self-grandiosity, leaving him even more certain of his destiny and invincibility. In terms of influence on events, it was more than Napoleon's personality that took effect. He reorganized France itself to supply the men and money needed for wars. He inspired his men. Wellington said his presence on the battlefield was worth 40,000 soldiers, for he inspired confidence from privates to field marshals. He also unnerved the enemy. At the Battle of Auerstadt in 1806, King Frederick William III of Prussia outnumbered the French by 63,000 to 27,000. However, when he mistakenly was told that Napoleon was in command, he ordered a hasty retreat that turned into a rout. The force of his personality neutralized material difficulties as his soldiers fought with the confidence that with Napoleon in charge, they would surely win. Image: Napoleon has become a worldwide cultural icon who symbolizes military genius and political power. Martin van Creveld described him as the most competent human being who ever lived. Since his death, many towns, streets, ships, and even cartoon characters have been named after him. He has been portrayed in hundreds of films and discussed in hundreds of thousands of books and articles. During the Napoleonic Wars, he was taken seriously by the British press as a dangerous tyrant, poised to invade. The British nicknamed him Boney. A nursery rhyme warned children that Bonaparte ravenously ate naughty people, the boogeyman. The British Tory press has depicted Napoleon as much smaller than average height before, and that image persisted. Confusion about his height results from the difference between the French paus and British inch 2, 71 cm and 2.54 cm, respectively. The myth of the Napoleon complex, named after him to describe men who have an inferiority complex, stems primarily from the fact that he was listed, incorrectly, as 5 feet 2 inches in French units at the time of his death. He was 168 centimeters, 5 ft6 in tall, an average height for a man of that period. In 1908, Alfred Adler, a psychologist, cited Napoleon to describe an inferiority complex in which short people adopt an overaggressive behavior to compensate for lack of height. This inspired the term Napoleon complex. The stock character of Napoleon is a comically short, petty tyrant. And this has become a cliché in popular culture. He is often portrayed wearing a large bicorn hat with a hand-in-waistcoat gesture, a reference to the painting produced in 1812 by Jacques-Louis David when he became first consul and later emperor. Napoleon eschewed his general's uniform and habitually wore the green colonel uniform non-hussar of a colonel of the chasseurs à cheval of the Imperial Guard. the regiment that served as his personal escort many times, with a large bicorn. He also habitually wore, usually on Sundays, the blue uniform of a colonel of the Imperial Guard Foot Grenadiers, blue with white facings and red cuffs. He also wore his Legion d'Honneur star, medal and ribbon, and the Order of the Iron Crown decorations, white French-style culottes, and white stockings. This was in contrast to the complex uniforms with many decorations of his marshals and those around him. Reforms. Napoleon instituted various reforms, such as higher education, a tax code, road and sewer systems, and established the Banque de France, the first central bank in French history. He negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with the Catholic Church, which sought to reconcile the mostly Catholic population to his regime. It was presented alongside the Organic Articles, which regulated public worship in France. He has dissolved the Holy Roman Empire prior to German unification later in the 19th century. The sale of the Louisiana Territory to the United States doubled the size of the United States. In May 1802, he instituted the Legion of Honor, a substitute for the old royalist decorations and orders of chivalry, to encourage civilian and military achievements. The order is still the highest decoration in France.